When Captain Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, was summoned to a U.S. federal courtroom, many expected a swift humiliation, an attempt to shame a defiant African leader into submission. But what unfolded instead was something no one saw coming, a calm, deliberate dismantling of Western arrogance broadcast to the world. This was supposed to be his reckoning. It became theirs. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was electric with anticipation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Weston straightened his red tie, eyes flitting to the empty defense chair. "No legal team?" he muttered to his junior. "None," she replied. Weston grinned. "Even refused counsel we offered. Excellent." But that grin wouldn't last the day. Outside, a storm raged. Rain pelted the windows. Protesters stood drenched, some chanting in solidarity, others shouting for justice. Inside, every seat was filled. Diplomats, intelligence agents, journalists from across the globe. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Cameras clicked softly. The U.S. government rarely put foreign leaders on trial, but when it did, the world watched. Then, the door opened. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the courtroom. Alone. No entourage, no lawyer, no translator. Just a modest olive-green uniform, no medals, no fanfare, only a presence. He walked with quiet conviction, every movement unshaken. Some didn't rise. A few chuckled under their breath. "That's him?" one diplomat sneered. "The man behind all this chaos?" The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elena Richards." A seasoned jurist with 3 decades on the bench, she entered with authority and poise. Her eyes locked with Traoré's. He didn't blink. There was something in that gaze, something that told her this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. The courtroom fell silent as she sat. "The United States versus Ibrahim Traoré," she read aloud. "Mr. Weston, you may proceed." Weston stood, confident. "Your Honor, under the Global Accountability Act of 2023, the defendant faces multiple charges: undermining international security protocols, disrupting regional stability, unauthorized military restructuring, interference in NATO operations, and obstruction of humanitarian aid." Gasps echoed through the room. These were not crimes of violence. They were accusations of power. The Global Accountability Act was already controversial, a law critics called a velvet-gloved form of neo-colonialism designed to bring rebellious leaders to heel. And now, Traoré was its first major test. Judge Richards turned to the defendant. "Captain Traoré, do you understand the charges brought against you?" "I understand what has been said," he replied calmly. His English was perfect. No accent strong enough to hide behind. No need for translation. Expectations shifted instantly. "Do you have legal representation?" "I will speak for myself," he answered. "The court advises you to reconsider." "With respect, Your Honor," he interjected, his voice quiet but firm. "If I cannot speak for myself, I should not be here at all." A ripple moved through the gallery. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. How do you plead?" "I plead nothing," he said. "I am here to speak truth. The rest is performance." Weston scoffed. He thought this would be easy. "Prosecution may begin questioning," the judge said. Weston approached. "Captain Traoré, do you acknowledge this court's authority to question your actions as a sovereign head of state?" It was a trap. Admit it. And he relinquished sovereignty. Deny it. And he appeared lawless. The air went still. Then Traoré answered. And with that first reply, everything began to change. Traoré lifted his gaze slowly. No anger, no fear. Just calm, unwavering clarity. "No," he said, "I do not recognize the authority of this court, but I recognize that the world is watching, so I will speak." A flicker of confusion crossed Weston's face. That wasn't the answer he had prepared for. He'd expected outrage or nervous submission, not this cool, composed redirection. Trying to regain control, Weston pressed on. "So you're admitting you don't respect international law?" "I respect law that is truly international," Traoré replied, "not laws written by the powerful to govern the powerless." Judge Richards leaned forward. "Captain Traoré, I understand your objections, but this court operates under established legal frameworks." "I know that, Your Honor, and I am here voluntarily, out of respect for dialogue. But I cannot pretend that my presence means I accept the premise of this trial." Something shifted. The room, once buzzing with the energy of prosecution, fell into a still, uneasy quiet. Journalists hesitated mid-keystroke. Diplomats whispered. This wasn't a man trying to avoid accountability. This was something else entirely. Weston cleared his throat. "Let's talk specifics. In March of last year, you expelled French military forces from Burkina Faso. These forces were conducting counterterrorism operations, and shortly after, extremist attacks surged. How do you justify putting your citizens at risk?" It was the prosecution's strongest card, casting Traoré as reckless, sacrificing security for pride. But instead of responding, Traoré reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn photograph and gently placed it on the witness stand's edge. "May I approach the bench?" he asked. Judge Richards hesitated, then nodded. Traoré handed her the photo. "This was taken 3 days before I made that decision." She studied the image. Her expression shifted. "For the record," she said, her voice low, "this appears to be a village. There are bodies on the ground." "Tinikov," Traoré said. 46 civilians, slaughtered while French troops were stationed just 20 kilometers away. The 8th massacre that month." He turned to Weston. His voice was quiet but carried force. "When I assumed leadership, my people weren't just living in poverty. They were dying. Foreign troops walked our streets, but the terrorists walked freer. Multinational corporations extracted our wealth, while our children studied under trees." His eyes scanned the courtroom. "For a decade, we were told to be patient, that security would come, that prosperity would follow, if we signed the right agreements, if we obeyed. That photo is what we got for our patience." Weston stiffened. "Tragedy doesn't justify dismantling a regional security structure. The French presence was part of a multilateral effort." "There were 2,400 terrorist attacks under that effort," Traoré said, interrupting. "In 5 years, after we replaced foreign soldiers with our own people, local volunteers, and military, attacks dropped 60% in 6 months. The gallery stirred. Whispers turned into audible gasps. "I didn't choose comfort. I chose sovereignty," he said. "And yes, I rejected help that came with chains." He locked eyes with Weston. "If that makes this courtroom uncomfortable, maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's the mirror I'm holding up." Weston's composure cracked. "Are you suggesting this court, this country, is hypocritical?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Traoré said. "I'm simply refusing to lie." There was no anger in his tone, just truth, unvarnished and undiluted, the kind that didn't need to shout. Judge Richards put down her pen. "Captain Traoré, please keep your answers within the scope of questioning." "I am," he said without hesitation. "You asked why I made certain choices. I'm explaining why survival demanded them." Weston began to pace, visibly off script now. His rehearsed arguments were slipping through his fingers. "Let's talk about the Wagner Group," he said sharply, pivoting to the Russian mercenaries referenced in intelligence briefings. Traoré didn't flinch. "You have reports?" he replied. "I have results." Judge Richards raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Traoré, while your popularity may be real, it does not replace the importance of legitimate governance." "With respect, Your Honor," Traoré said, When your nation faced existential threats in its infancy, did it not also suspend norms in the name of survival? He straightened his back. His voice was calm, but something unshakable burned beneath it. History forgave those decisions because they protected something bigger. I ask only the same consideration. Judge us not by whether we follow your rule book, but by whether we are building a future where rules can matter at all. And in that moment, something cracked. The air had shifted. The judge's questions were growing more thoughtful. The audience wasn't leaning away, they were leaning in, not in judgment, in fascination. The courtroom had started as a stage for condemnation, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. After a short recess, Weston returned with a new strategy. Security and democracy hadn't worked. Maybe economics would. Captain Traoré, he began, voice steady but colder. Since taking office, you've canceled multiple contracts with Western mining companies, seized control of several gold mines, and redirected profits to your government. These actions have cost shareholders billions and violated international investment treaties. He laid a report on the evidence table. This document outlines the economic damage your policies have caused to businesses operating in good faith. Traoré glanced at it but didn't touch it. Legitimate, he repeated softly. An interesting word. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the contract referenced in that report gave 92% of profits to the foreign company. It was signed by an official who, a month later, received a villa in Monaco. Is that what Mr. Weston means by legitimate? Before she could respond, Traoré continued, voice steady, deliberate. As for good faith, that same contract permitted cyanide leaching, banned in Europe and the U.S., and gave companies unlimited access to groundwater in drought-prone regions. It required our soldiers to guard foreign assets, yet denied us the right to inspect working conditions. He paused. Each sentence landed like a quiet explosion. We didn't cancel these contracts, we corrected them. The mines still run, the companies still earn, just not excessively, and now our children go to schools built from our own gold. Weston slammed his palm on the table. That's not how international commerce works. You can't just rewrite terms because you feel like it. Mr. Weston, Judge Richards interrupted, her voice sharp. Please maintain decorum. But Traoré was already answering. When those terms were imposed through corruption and coercion, correction is not a violation. It is justice. It's not just our right. It's our duty. He turned to the gallery, scanning diplomats and journalists. Many here represent countries that rewrote economic rules when convenient. Banks were rescued, debts forgiven, contracts renegotiated. But when African nations demand the same, suddenly, those agreements become sacred scripture. He leaned forward. If economic sovereignty is a crime, then I am guilty. But so is every country that ever chose its people over foreign shareholders. A hush fell. Then, from the front row, a Ukrainian diplomat began to applaud, softly. A court officer gave him a warning glare. He stopped, but the moment had already spread. Several others had joined before falling silent. Weston looked to the judge for rescue, but found her expression unreadable. His case was eroding beneath him. Call to audience. If you've learned something new about global justice today, hit that like button and tell us in the comments, should a nation prioritize its sovereignty over international contracts? Desperate to regain ground, Weston turned to his final weapon, humanitarianism. Captain Traoré, he said, your government's policies have led to major aid organizations suspending their operations in Burkina Faso. Doctors Without Borders, United Nations Children's Fund, the World Food Program, all report interference. How do you justify obstructing critical aid to your own people? It was a bulletproof charge. Who could justify denying food and medicine? Traoré nodded solemnly. Mr. Weston, have you ever visited one of these aid centers in my country? I haven't personally, but the data— I have, Traoré interrupted. Many times, before and after I took office. He turned toward the gallery, speaking now not just to the court, but to the world. Let me describe what I saw. Foreign staff in walled compounds with swimming pools and air conditioning. Brand new SUVs that cost more than a village earns in a year. Administrative offices consuming 60% of project budgets. And distribution models that create dependency, not dignity. He let that sink in. We did not expel aid organizations. We asked them to evolve, to buy food locally instead of importing it, to train Burkina Faso doctors, not rotate foreign staff every 6 months, to work with our government, not operate above it. He raised his hands slightly. Some listened and stayed. Today they're doing better work than ever. Others refused. They chose to leave rather than change. Weston seized on the moment. You're disregarding decades of humanitarian best practices. Your government is barely 2 years old. You think you can rewrite global relief policy overnight? Traoré's voice rose, just slightly. The calm sharpened. Best practices? After 50 years of these best practices, we remain poor. Our problems remain. At what point do we ask whether these practices are truly the best? Silence. He continued, his passion tightly reined in. Foreign aid, as it stands, often preserves the very suffering it claims to fix. It treats symptoms while maintaining the system that causes the illness. Even Weston looked momentarily lost. Judge Richards removed her glasses, pinched the bridge of her nose. I believe we could all use a break. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the gallery broke into low conversation, Traoré remained alone at the witness stand. Still, unmoving. No one approached him. No one dared. And when court resumed, something was different. Weston's confidence had vanished. He no longer looked like a man pressing his case, just a man trying to survive the rest of the cross-examination. Mr. Traoré, Weston said, carefully choosing his final shot, do you regret anything about your time in power? It was meant to be the final trap. Admit fault, and his credibility cracks. Deny it, and he looks arrogant. There was a pause, a long, heavy pause. Yes, Traoré said. Weston straightened in his chair, sensing victory at last. But Traoré kept speaking. I regret not acting sooner. I regret believing the world would come when we cried for help. I regret thinking respect could be requested. His voice didn't rise, but the power behind it grew with each word. Respect must be earned or taken. The atmosphere shifted. The courtroom no longer belonged to the judge or the lawyers. It belonged to the man who dared to speak what others wouldn't. I regret the children who died while we waited for permission to save them. I regret that we sold our dignity so cheaply, for so long. Then he turned to Judge Richards, no longer as a defendant, but as a peer. Above all, I regret that we must even have this conversation, that a sovereign nation must explain itself for choosing independence. That sovereignty has been turned into a privilege when it should be a right. The silence was thunderous. Weston looked down, closed his folder. No further questions, Your Honor, he said quietly. But Traoré wasn't done. He stood. This trial isn't about justice. It's about discomfort. The discomfort of seeing an African nation choose dignity over dependency. The discomfort of watching us walk alone. His eyes scanned the room, reporters, diplomats, observers, all frozen in place. So, if I am to be judged for giving my people their pride back, then let the verdict be recorded for history. Judge Richards opened her mouth to speak, but Weston cut in. Your Honor, he said quickly, voice suddenly unsure, the prosecution requests a recess. Heads turned. The same man who had walked in with a smirk now looked pale, shaken. "A recess?" the judge repeated. "We just returned from one." Weston cleared his throat. "The government would like time to review its position on certain aspects of the case." Judge Richards studied him, then gave a slow nod. "Very well. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." But tomorrow never came. If this moment moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for stories that go deeper than headlines. Comment below, should sovereignty ever need permission? The hearing was quietly suspended. Official statements cited jurisdictional complexities and further review. But by then, it didn't matter. Clips of Traoré's testimony flooded the internet, translated into dozens of languages. They jumped from platform to platform, continent to continent. "We chose dignity over dependency" became a rallying cry. In Cairo, students printed it on banners. In Caracas, professors analyzed his words in lectures. In Paris, London, and Johannesburg, his name became a subject of debate in diplomatic circles. 3 days later, protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Not hundreds, but thousands. Some carried signs bearing Traoré's image. Others held mirrors. A silent, powerful message. CNN aired a special report, "The Trial That Backfired." The Guardian ran an editorial questioning the Global Accountability Act's legitimacy. Even Fox News asked whether U.S. foreign policy had lost touch with global realities. Inside the halls of power, things were changing fast. Intelligence memos once dismissing Traoré as a fleeting strongman were torn up, rewritten. "He's tapped into something," one State Department official reportedly said, "and we don't understand it yet." A week later, Traoré returned to Burkina Faso. But unlike the quiet departure, his return was thunderous. From the airport in Ouagadougou, people lined the streets, 17 kilometers deep. Women ululated, drums echoed, children perched on shoulders waving handmade flags. They weren't told to come. They came because something had changed. Their leader had stood in the lion's den and refused to bow. He had spoken their truth to the world, and he had come back not in shame, but in triumph. His vehicle crawled through the crowd. He stood through the sunroof not with pomp, but with his fist raised, not as a ruler, but as one of them. At the presidential palace, he finally addressed the nation. "They called me to their court, thinking I would be judged," he said. "But it was not I who was exposed." The crowd erupted. They believed our sovereignty was negotiable, that our dignity had a price. He scanned the sea of faces. They were wrong. That night, while celebrations roared across the capital, Traoré met with his cabinet. There was no self-congratulation, no victory speeches, only resolve. "We've captured the world's attention," he said. "Now we must turn that attention into action." He issued orders on the spot. Accelerate rural electrification, double output at the new pharmaceutical plant, fast-track agricultural irrigation projects. He understood something critical. Speeches don't build nations. Action does. The ripple effects didn't stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Within weeks, Mali and Niger announced a formal federation with Burkina Faso, pooling military resources, establishing a shared investment policy, and prioritizing regional industries over foreign extraction. A new alliance was taking shape, not built in the shadows of former empires, but rising in the light of something new. Chad's government was the first to follow. Citing new regional standards for resource sovereignty, it began renegotiating oil contracts with Western energy firms. Then Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, long seen as loyal allies of the West, quietly shifted course, demanding local cocoa processing before export and reviewing long-standing military cooperation agreements. In Washington, Brussels, Paris, alarm bells rang. The old model, pressure and punishment, had failed. Traoré had become too visible, too admired. Something more subtle was needed now. "We can't make him a martyr," one EU diplomat warned an American counterpart over a secure line. "But we can't let this spread either." And so the response changed. Suddenly, headlines began to question Burkina Faso's human rights record. Financial analysts painted dire forecasts. Social media accounts circulated stories of instability, of repression, of collapse. But something fundamental had shifted. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. For every critical report, 10 independent creators posted videos praising Burkina Faso's bold direction. African academics, once silent, began openly dissecting Western influence. New books were commissioned, university curriculums were rewritten. What was once dismissed as the rhetoric of radicals had entered the mainstream. 6 months after the trial that never resumed, a private jet touched down on a quiet airstrip near Ouagadougou. No cameras, no press, no official greeting. The man who disembarked was Marcus Weston, the U.S. prosecutor who had once walked into a courtroom with a confident smirk and walked out visibly shaken. No one tracked his car to the presidential compound. His meeting with Ibrahim Traoré wasn't listed on any schedule. Inside a plain office, the two men sat alone. No staff, no notes, no microphones. They spoke for 4 hours. What was said has never been revealed. When Weston emerged, his expression was unreadable. But he declined the military escort offered to him, choosing instead to walk alone through the capital, taking in a city and perhaps a world he no longer viewed the same way. 2 weeks later, Weston resigned from the U.S. Department of Justice. His only public statement was brief. "There are moments when your entire perspective changes. I've had such a moment." He rejected all interview requests and quietly accepted a teaching role at a small college in Vermont. His course, International Relations. Enrollment doubled within the first semester. Would you have liked to be a fly on the wall during that meeting? Drop your theory in the comments below. What do you think was said? 1 year after the aborted Washington hearing, Ibrahim Traoré faced his greatest test yet. Progress had been real, but uneven. Terrorist attacks had declined, but not vanished. Economic reforms had sparked hope, but also disruption. The road of sovereignty was proving as painful as it was necessary. On the anniversary of his return home, just hours before a nationally televised address, terrible news arrived. A terrorist raid near the northern border. 30 civilians dead, a school burned, children kidnapped. His advisors were blunt. "Cancel the speech," they urged. "Let us handle the crisis first." Traoré refused. That evening, with no prepared text and no teleprompter, he addressed the nation. "Today, enemies of our nation murdered the innocent," he said. "They believe terror will drive us to surrender, that we will beg for foreign protection, that we will return to old habits of dependency." He looked straight into the camera. "They are wrong." He offered no excuses, only action. He announced a surge in civilian defense training, expansion of drone production, and new intelligence-sharing alliances with neighboring nations. "The path we have chosen is not easy," he said. "If it were, it would have been walked long ago. There will be losses. There will be days when the old ways seem safer." His voice rose, not in anger, but in strength. "But we will not turn back. Not because I demand it, but because you, the people of Burkina Faso, have tasted dignity. And having tasted it, you will accept nothing less." The speech was not triumphant. It promised no easy fix. And yet, it echoed far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Leaders across the continent quoted it. Political science departments added it to their syllabi. Even critics acknowledged its moral gravity. Washington had tried to brand Traoré as a dangerous radical. Instead, it revealed something far more powerful, a leader unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths, unafraid to challenge old paradigms, unafraid to pay the price of independence. 3 years after the trial that was meant to humble him, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly, not as a revolutionary, not as a defendant, but as an elected president. His election hadn't followed Western formulas. It combined modern voting with traditional village consultations. It emphasized consensus over competition. Critics called it unorthodox. Supporters called it authentic. What no one could deny was its legitimacy. And in a world increasingly unsure of its own ideals, that legitimacy, earned, not granted, was Traoré's most powerful weapon of all. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium, the chamber fell into reverent silence. This was no longer the military officer who had seized power amid chaos. This was a statesman, tempered by fire, proven through principle. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "I do not come before you to declare victory, but to invite partnership, not as a perfect nation, but as one determined to write its own story." He spoke not of defiance, but of vision, of a new global architecture shaped by South-South cooperation, bypassing the legacy power centers, of technology transfers that empowered rather than enslaved, of security frameworks built with cultural context in mind, not imposed from afar. "The world is changing," he said. "The only question is whether our institutions will change with it, or be replaced by those that will." It was not a warning. It was a simple truth, spoken by a man who had already dared to act. And when he finished, the chamber did something rare. It rose. Delegates representing over half the world's population stood in a spontaneous, sustained ovation. Not just African nations, but leaders from Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Applauding a man once dismissed as a rebel, now recognized as a voice of conscience. In the back of the hall, a silver-haired woman observed quietly. Judge Eleanor Richards, now retired, sat as an anonymous guest among the crowd, the same judge who once presided over Traoré's trial in Washington. A journalist nearby leaned in and asked for her thoughts. "History rarely moves in straight lines," she replied. "Sometimes it needs a disruption to find its proper course." She watched as Traoré shook hands with dignitaries who once saw him as a threat. "We thought we were judging him," she said softly. "Perhaps he was judging us." The journalist pushed gently. "Do you believe the trial was a mistake?" Richards smiled faintly. "I believe it revealed truths that needed to be seen, just not the ones we expected." She rose to leave, but paused. "The court of world opinion delivers its own verdicts," she added. "And those, unlike ours, tend to endure." Outside the UN building, a soft rain began to fall over New York City. Times Square glowed with its usual noise: celebrity gossip, economic headlines, flashing distractions. But far beyond the lights, in government halls, lecture rooms, community centers, and across digital platforms, a deeper conversation was still echoing. A conversation sparked in a Washington courtroom, when a young African leader refused to play the role written for him. Ibrahim Traoré didn't enter history because he seized power. He entered history because he spoke truth to it, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every people denied their right to define their own future. A trial designed to humiliate him had instead anointed him, not just with political legitimacy, but with something far more enduring: moral clarity. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more narratives that challenge the scripts we've been told to accept.